Well, hello everybody. I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch. I hope it's good today. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Josh Aaron. I'm the CEO of Aiden Technologies. Aiden stands for AI for desktops and enterprise networks. And we think we're doing something new and cool, and definitely happy that you could join us for lunch today. And for everybody out there, happy to have you tuned in. And really looking forward to speaking with my guest in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of why we're here today and what we think we're doing in the industry. One of the things that we see as a key gap or key challenge in the industry these days is that even though patches and vulnerabilities that are coming out and being discovered, software manufacturers and producers are having those vulnerabilities generally solved and patches available within 24 hours of a discovery of a vulnerability in more than 80% of the cases, and yet it's taking 102 days is the stat in the industry to get these things rolled out and patched onto systems. And it's just taking too long, right? It's kind of unbelievable that there's that kind of dwell time still in the industry. Even though we have lots of tools on the market to help IT people with this problem, it's just kind of pervasive. And we're all trying to fight the same problems, right? Every company around the world is trying to deal with the fact that they've got to be less vulnerable, they've got to batten down the hatches, and they've got to build their organizations to be more secure. And the problem with the endpoint security space these days is that it is incredibly tedious manual work for a lot of people to do. Even though the tools are on the market, this is just one example. We've documented an awful lot of steps, over 22 steps, I think, if you look at this chart in detail. And yes, it's taking 3.5 months on average, as we just said, to get this done. But the hackers are using automation against us every day. And the stats in the industry are that they're hacking us more than 6 times faster than we're able to patch our systems and reduce our vulnerabilities to protect our landscape and our footprint. So something clearly has to change. The cost of this problem in 2020, we studied it. This is just based on the US and reported breaches, was over $3.24 billion. And then when we repeated the study and we looked at it again in 2021, despite having all this technology that you all are here to see today that's out on the showroom floor, it's still going up. So what's happening, right? We have 1 million systems, threat monitoring, threat detection, all kinds of things. But over 60% of the problems are attributable to a missing patch or poor patch management. So it's still kind of a fundamental thing in IT that needs to be done in order to satisfy security and build our companies to have a better security posture. And you know, if anybody wants to check my math, I'd be happy to have them come by the booth and we can go over it. The funny thing to me is that these numbers are based on reported breaches. We're not even looking at the breaches that are not reported. And I happen to know about a Fortune 75 company that was breached recently that I have friends working on the team. And, you know, that's a not reported breach. It happens all the time. So what's the real cost? $1 trillion maybe? Globally? What's the root of the problem? Why does it keep happening? We know what the problem is. I think we've known what the problem is for 30 or 35 years that I've been in IT. There's growing complexity. Our computers and our systems keep getting harder and harder to maintain and take care of. And there's growing complexity in the cyber landscape in that the threat actors are using new techniques all the time and they're innovating probably faster than we're able to remediate a lot of things. But there's also fundamentally a lack of alignment. And this is something that in this room may not be all that popular to talk about sometimes, but that is the CISOs of the world and the CTOs or CIOs of the world don't always have the same incentives. The CISO side of the world, IT security, has to be incredibly concerned all the time about locking things down, protecting our identity, doing all of the things that are necessary to keep us protected. But the CIOs and CTOs of the world are being incentivized to create more flexibility, make a better work experience, right? Ultimately improve end user experience at all costs. Of course, we don't want to sacrifice security, but those two things are not in alignment. It's very hard to create great security and great privacy, as we all know, and still maintain flexibility and optionality. Those things, and convenience, those things don't go well together. And so we have problems with alignment, and we also don't have a common language to speak. And there's a lack of resources. We see this all the time. We hear about the Great Resignation. I think when I got into IT in the 90s, they were talking about a lack of IT resources. We're still talking about a lack of IT resources. I don't know if anybody in this room feels differently. Does anybody in this room feel like they have all the resources that they need right now to do the job that they're tasked to do by their company? If so, I would love to hear it. Not one hand, right? It's really scary when you think about this today. None of us feel we have the resources we need to get the job done. And none of us are being given an unlimited pile of money or a blank check to get the job done. But we still have to do it. So what are we going to do? Well, to combat things like growing complexity, we need speed, but we also need visibility. We need some way to see across the entire landscape what is happening, what is the state of every single computer in our compute environment. We need to have a common language. We need to be in a place where CISOs and CTOs are often writing company policies. They're putting them down in Word documents or management reports or PowerPoint presentations and saying, this is what we're going to do. But then the IT engineers that have to go implement this in IT security are writing PowerShell scripts and database queries, SQL queries, and all kinds of other language. And I don't know about everyone in this room, but I can tell you for me, it's been a long time since I had my hands. I was a CTO and a CIO, but it's been years since I had my hands on a PowerShell script, right? So I can't always know every single thing that every engineer in my company is doing, nor do I want to have to, right? I need to be able to understand that what they're doing is what we wanted done when we set the policy, when we made the decisions. And then lastly, automation, right? If we have a lack of resources, what can we automate, right? Find the things that are low-hanging fruit to automate those processes so that we can free up the engineers that are on our teams who all, I mean, does anybody here have an engineer that doesn't want to do what they would call more high-value work, more important work for their company? Maybe building the CEO's Power BI dashboard or something that, you know, people in the business and leadership really care about. Because a lot of the manual IT work that we're doing in IT security, business leaders see it as maintenance, right? Just like, oh, those IT guys, they're doing that thing. It's critical to the security of our business, but they don't really want to talk about it often or hear about it until there is a public event or a breach or something happens. So if we can automate that work, we can elevate ourselves as IT professionals to work on higher value problems. I'm here today to talk to you about the solution. Aiden. The world's first AI bot that completely autonomously builds computers, patches computers, and ensures that they have all the software that they're supposed to have and nothing that they aren't supposed to have. And it does it with a combination of AI and hyperautomation so that our engineers don't have to do this manual, tedious, repetitive process. The way that Aiden works, it's reading plain English. The policy files of the company or the organization are built in plain English. So I think here it's saying Adobe Acrobat DC is for any workstation in sales or marketing. We all know what that means in this room, right? But an IT engineer looks at that and says, well, they don't just mean any version of Adobe Acrobat DC. They mean the latest version that was approved by the cybersecurity team that's in our library that we can use. And they know that that now needs to get on every single workstation. Aiden thinks like an IT engineer. And it just figures out from a plain English statement like that what an IT engineer would, the same inference an IT person would make in an intelligent IT organization, and puts that on the machine. and make sure that it happens. Here's a quick glimpse of Aiden running in real time. And Aiden is looking at this machine as a standard machine, but we just changed the configuration to get it ready for someone in marketing. And that fast, Aiden looked at every binary on that machine, made all the decisions it needs to make about not just what to put on, but then how to apply them and in what order. So if there are prerequisites, if there's a .NET framework or something like that that was needed for a later application, it's going to do it in the right order every time. And it's dynamic. So if the policy were to change in the middle of it building this loadout, it's going to go back, figure out that change and any prerequisites to that change and do it automatically. So that when the machine finishes, it's built to a complete, what we call desired state configuration, or someone else said to me the other day, we like to call it guaranteed state. This is about building every computer into a state that your company wants to guarantee to its end user community, to its board, for their liking. The results have been staggering. We've been doing this for a couple of years, and we already see a 97% reduction in vulnerabilities across our customers, 95% less time of engineering hours, IT engineering and IT security engineering hours put into doing this kind of tedious, repetitive work, and a 75% reduction in help desk tickets. And people say those numbers are unbelievable. Well, the reason you get these numbers is not just because of the automation, but when you have automation building consistency across every aspect of your environment. Servers, virtual machines, physical laptops and desktops that are out in the field in the end user population, machine liquid handlers, which we may be talking about. The consistency of the software across the entire environment is so high that help desk issues don't tend to repeat themselves. If you do see a problem anywhere, you fix it in one place, quickly with automation cascaded to the entire organization. You don't have multiple versions of software that you're not supposed to have running that are still sitting out there. And you basically nip in the bud all the additional follow-on tickets that come through. And you can see the quote here on the bottom right. This is a CISO of a publicly traded company, a very prolific company in biotechnology, and they're seeing incredible results. I would like to stop presenting to you and bring that person up on stage so that we can have a live conversation and we can talk about it. And I deeply encourage your questions throughout. So please, if somebody has a question, let us know. We'll get you a microphone. And we'd love to take your question today as well. Dave Ruedger, welcome to the stage.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate everything that Josh and his team has done for us in our particular sector. For those of you who don't know me, I've been doing some version of IT, cybersecurity for longer than I care to speak publicly, because then you know how old I am. But let's just say it's in decades, not years. By and large, the journey that I've had has taken me everywhere from doing straight technical support. I started off doing that for about 6 years. Then I was consulting for many years. And then much like Josh and his journey now, I had my own company for 14. And in that time, I really got to do a lot of deep dive in sort of the IT operations, security in general, how you build software securely, how you build basically a cloud platform even before companies like Amazon figured out that this was something, the direction of the future. So, much of my career has really been at the edge of innovation and trying to figure out how we can do things at scale with less resources. That would be people and also, the spend, because when you're running your own company, it's really important to not invest in areas that are going to be impactful for your bottom line, given the fact that it's hard to hire people and retain people and all that good stuff. And of course, even nowadays, it's much worse than it was when I had my own company. So, things that Josh and team have been doing with Aiden have been extremely helpful for us to try to solve some of that people problem up front, right? So, the quote that we had about the reduction of vulnerabilities, which also leads to a reduction of people time, that's very tangible. And the way that we saw it in our own environment was, you have these kind of walls between the security initiatives and the IT initiatives, right? And it's hard enough to find good security people. It's also hard to find good IT and operations people. it's even harder to get them to align and have the same common vision of what you're trying to achieve day to day in your overall programs and your strategies for doing good security, but also good operations. So what Aiden was really enabling for us was to get some of that tighter integration and capabilities to have the teams more closely aligned, simply because it has a really good platform for us to assign what the particular software packages are, what the state looks like for some of these machines. And the reason why we had such a significant reduction both in time and cost is that these were in lab environments, right? So if any of you are in industries that are highly regulated or have very specific requirements for things to exist at a certain state, a guaranteed state, as Josh said, it's very important, right? Any specific change that would happen in that stack, which could be anything from the OS layer, it could be parts of your application, drivers, things that are really required for you to maintain the capabilities of that entire end-to-end system, becomes impactful when you're talking to regulators and auditors for doing compliance. So for us, it was a twofold problem. We couldn't go in and actually take down systems regularly, right? So if we want to make sure that we're always at a consistent state, the best way to do it is do it in real time. Patch comes out, boom, off you go. And certainly that's something that Aiden could provide to us. But at the same time, we also have to consider that any type of real downtime for some of these systems meant that we couldn't process some of our samples. We couldn't actually move the needle when it comes to doing what is part of our core mission, which is trying to convert samples, whether it's blood or saliva, into genetic information, which then starts to fuel our whole digital platform for unlocking healthcare capabilities across the entire ecosystem. So when you see these kind of cascading things that happen, an initial cost of maybe it impacts one machine. Well, if that one machine is actually part of a larger system, which means that now you have multiple people who can't continue to process samples. And then you have IT staff that has to come in and do a lot of their special work to ensure it comes back online. And then the security people to make sure that we haven't introduced anything into the networks, because if it was motivated by, let's say, malware or ransomware, now we've got a bigger problem overall. And you can see that the recovery time actually becomes more costly than the actual incident itself. So when we were looking at various solutions that would help us with that, there were a number of options, obviously. I think we've all been familiar with things like vulnerability management and scanning and all those types of tools. But when you get into the remediation phase of actually doing this at scale, it becomes a much different challenge, right? And the first thing, which is why it was appealing with Josh when he first came to me, it was like, well, we're not an agent. I was like, okay, now you just opened my eyes, because that's the first thing I'll ask whenever I see new technologies. Like, you want to put another agent on my endpoint? Okay, I already got 5. So how are you going to play in the same sandbox, right? So we got past that challenge initially. And then it just started looking like a better integration with our entire ecosystem. And that allowed us to really get creative about how we could optimize the experience overall. So anyway, that's kind of a good segue into how I got here and how I started the journey with Aiden in general.
So I was listening to you just now, and it's interesting. You described a lot of the use case and the problems and the things that we're doing, but I hear this so much, and I think you're hearing it sometimes internally too. People will say those results seem unbelievable, right? You claimed, and we've talked about this, a 90% reduction in time spent and big dollars saved. What do you say internally when people on the leadership team, or even down the line in business lines, say, how do you prove it to me, Dave? How do you know we got those results, right? And what's your answer to people internally when they want to know, is it real?
It's kind of difficult in the sense that you're proving a negative, right? When you really look at it in terms of dollars and cents, you can come to the stuff that's really tangible, which is it's one person's time for this one thing, and we can quantify that. But then when you start looking at a very holistic view of, well, what is the actual business impact? It's not just a system impact or a person's time impact, but it's the impact of the overall business, that you start to realize that some of these things are not just a specific cost. Yeah, maybe you spent a few thousand or $20,000 of actual time to recover a system because it went completely down. But what was the cascading impact of that system not being available? Well, I have 5 people that can't do anything now because the entire system that it's part of is down. I also have costs of bringing in some outside resources to take a look at the why. I mean, especially if you're in highly regulated industries, you've got ITIL, you've got to, have very specific documentation around root cause analysis and failures, because eventually a regulator and auditor is going to come in and demand to see it. So all of those things in totality actually start creating a much bigger overall dollar commitment for failure, right? And if you're not thinking about that, especially at an executive level and working with your peers, whether they're in software or pure operations, and trying to understand what those cascading impacts are, you're basically on the hook for a lot more of actual cost of the business than just, a specific incident that might impact 1, 2, 3 systems. And it's largely because of that, when we looked at it in totality in terms of, the processing of our core business at the sample level, and then getting into the digital platform, and then also being able to monetize with various relationships that we have, it's like that cost analysis across the entire ecosystem actually becomes very impactful.
So when you look at that, can you share with us some of the organizational outcomes that have come out of it, beyond just the IT savings and all that, right? And security vulnerabilities, but what have been the biggest impacts to the organization by doing?
Well, I think the biggest one on the IT side was the fact that, we're always down people, right? So trying to get the operational hands-on, especially in these lab environments where it really required very high touch. You would go to individual specific machines. It had to be, highly observed. There was a whole checklist of things that had to be done that really required it to be a much more manual effort than we would have liked. And by looking at what we could do with the Aiden experience and checking a lot of the boxes from the compliance and making sure that only certain things were put on these machines at certain times, we got to the point where we could automate that and effectively not have to have someone stand directly in front of a machine in a highly controlled environment where the physical security was important and who has access to what was very much a controlled experience. So by looking at it from that standpoint, we didn't have to scale and get more people. What we could do is actually process re-engineer, and then the scaling would happen directly within the Aiden experience. And as a result of that, it's actually kicked off a number of different conversations about how we do deployment at scale across the board, not even in our lab environments, but for things like remote endpoints, now that we have a lot of people working remotely, and our remote contractors. And actually very interesting scenario that we're exploring right now, where we have folks that are in parts of Europe, Eastern Europe. We had some contractors in Russia, for example, that were recently impacted by the conflict. So having the ability to maintain certain software stack from a security standpoint has been really helpful for us to do that without needing, a physical impossibility of actually getting a person in front of that particular screen. So I also realized that as a CISO, I was a CTO and a CIO, never really CISO, but I wore both hats at one point. But when I was talking to people from the CISO lens, a lot of times it's hard to convince the IT side that you want more security, you want them to do something. Mm-hmm. I talked a little bit about the alignment problem, right? Right. Cultural alignment around these initiatives. I even have a friend who jokingly says, my CTO, we call her the CT no. Because every time I go to her with things we need to do in security that would make the organization less vulnerable, it's an inconvenience to her and her team to get it done, right? And I think a lot of us don't like to address that problem or don't like to talk about it publicly that much, but I'm going to ask you, what's it like in Invitae, and how do you convince IT leadership from the CISO perspective, and you've been both, so you're a rare breed, how
how do you convince from the CISO lens when you're not the one that actually has to implement a solution like Aiden,
Right.
but you're just saying, I see this, we need this, it's a good idea. How do you get them to perform?
Well, that really is the million-dollar question for all of us, right? Is especially being a CISO, you're spot on. We don't actually control any of the experience. We're literally the security guard in the bank that's being robbed, saying like, "Hey, you're being robbed," or you know what? We probably should close the door because we're going to get robbed. And so, we really have a big challenge dealing with a lot of the other leaders of trying to convince them that what we're advocating is actually in both of our best interests, right? Security as a driver is good, and especially if you're regulated or you have a compliance, it's a good hammer. You can actually get people to move faster that normally wouldn't. However, you don't want to rely on that because then you're going to be constantly in Chicken Little mode of using fear to drive programs, and that never ends well. So the strategy that I've always used is looking through the lens of risk and then mapping it directly to business impacts, right? If you have a discussion that you start initially, which looks like, how is this going to help move the needle for us for either generating more revenue or getting better cost reduction? Because that's a bottom line, especially for publicly traded companies, is tangible. The investors see it, the shareholders see it, and it's just good business practice. So if you start to look at the problem statement from that angle initially, security is just an added benefit. What you're really trying to do is grease the wheels of commerce, right? And I've had a lot of good results with those kinds of conversations because then you start from a standpoint of being a partner, a partnership, an advocate, as opposed to I'm telling you to do and you guys are not doing it. And so this makes an adversarial relationship. And generally what we've seen at Invitae is the software teams, they want to do better. So they're actually cooperating more with a lot of the recommendations that we're making. We're doing shift left strategies, which means we don't really respond after the fact. We're looking at ways to bake it in up front, and then you can start to make those arguments. If we do this, we're actually going to free up more of your time, which means you can get more agile and you can develop more software quickly. And then all of a sudden everyone's like, well, this sounds like a good idea. What can we do? So I think that's the lens that we have to approach things with. If we always come after the fact from like the auditor standpoint of like, well, you're not doing, then we're always going to be in that sort of reactive mode, which is just going to be more expensive overall anyway.
So kind of a follow-up. I listen to what you're saying, and I think of it as silos in an organization. It's hard to sometimes break through. Since doing Aiden, have you felt like there's been true progress in breaking through some of those traditional silos at Invitae and getting buy-in around more of this because of it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the benefits of doing kind of the land and expand model, right? You start small, you build out, you show success, and then you can have that demonstrable ROI, and then all of a sudden, you can start to apply this to other parts of the organization. IT's right. I mean, we know that there's plenty of areas within an organization where, just based on the growth of the company, you've got levels of maturity. Like in our case, and I think even in your case, Josh, coming from the PE world, you've got mergers and acquisitions, which means companies that are coming into the fold are actually not at a level of maturity that your core business is. And that gives you an opportunity to address risk in real time when things happen. So clearly having these types of projects that give us the ability to show success quickly without requiring a lot of intervention and additional cost for implementation, professional services and whatnot, actually gave us the fuel to be able to go back and have meaningful conversations about how we could actually transform other parts of the business at scale more quickly where that was never even being discussed before.
So I want to pause for a minute there. Thank you. That was really fantastic. And I'm sure people may have some questions they've thought of or would like to ask Dave. Is there anybody I can call upon to ask a question? Would anybody like to ask a question?
You guys got it all figured out?
Okay. Well, sure.
Here's how it's going. What are some of the KPIs that
So I'll just repeat it real quick for the audience at home, so to speak. And we would love you to join us in Dallas next year if you're not here personally. But the question is, what are some of the key KPIs that you're able to actually, show and deliver to the board and really focus on?
Great question, because it ties directly into the observability and the demonstrable ROI, right? So there were two things that we looked at with respect to this. One, just in pure kind of vulnerability management and understanding the state of what we have. I mean, we have vulnerability scanning. We've got tools that are looking at things, right? Being able to kind of provide answers to questions that the board would be asking specifically because of things that happened since the beginning of the year. We had Spring4Shell, for example, and Log4j. It's like all of these have impacts in parts of the organization. And so the first question would be, what's our risk? Well, I can try to see whether or not we have any exposure to that from the various tools that we have, but it's only as good as the last time it ran. Whereas we're something like Aiden, where we get a more or less real-time view of the state of things, knowing that we've got these packages that have already been distributed, the visibility that we got was much more immediate, right? So having the ability to kind of close that window of opportunity in terms of where the real risk was based upon what we're seeing in the field, it was super helpful. The other part of that too is then once you correlate that back to what you can see is actually burning down that risk in real time, you can correlate it back to what your residual risk is at the business, assuming you have good asset management and understand where your exposure could be. So those two things in conjunction, I think, really help us paint an accurate picture of where we are whenever something comes up. That was always a challenge for me in previous roles, especially like when WannaCry happened. The first question they're asked is, well, what's our exposure? Are we safe? Okay, well, I can tell you we're safe because I know this was patched here, here, and here. And then 2 weeks later, someone deploys a new image that was actually an old image sitting in a repository, and then a month later, you find out you're still exposed to WannaCry, right? And I think with the capabilities that we've been seeing with Aiden, we have the ability to actually go and remediate in real time. In fact, because it's a guaranteed state, right, we can actually have the Aiden bot go take a look at that. And if someone did deploy something from an old image, for example, it would get updated almost immediately.
Any other questions?
So everybody says they have AI, right? So that's kind of sleight of hand. What is AI? What makes yours different? Why is it real?
And you're asking me, yes?
This is for you, Josh.
This one's for me. The question was, everybody says they have AI. What is AI? What makes yours different? How do we know it's real? We certainly get that a lot at Aiden. It's what I was saying a little bit in the presentation, the fact that it isn't just an if-then next kind of approach to IT patch management or some kind of implementation of building out a machine. Aiden's AI is reading natural language. It's reading English and then making inferences, not just based on everything that it read and what an IT engineer would do in that scenario given that statement, but what it already has learned about the company. So a very simplistic example might be, I know that this particular business uses OneLogin as its single sign-on tool, or Microsoft SSO, for example. I know that this particular application requires integration with that, and I know that if this patch breaks that integration, I need to reset up that integration, right? It takes all those additional steps into account, and the more Aiden learns about each customer's business, the more automated it becomes. And it's not just in the AI bot that runs on the endpoints, it's also part of the way that we build what we call highly intelligent packages that are part of the package repository. They actually get created. There's a way of segregating common code, which are, take an application like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. Obviously, lots of organizations are using video conferencing these days. So Aiden needs to know things like, if someone's in a video conference and you're trying to patch that application, don't do it while someone's in the middle of a video conference. Pause, wait, look for a time to do it later. But perhaps in the organization they have VDI and they have desktops and laptops, and the process for installing the Microsoft Teams in this example is different on all of those. Plus, in different parts of the organization, maybe they're using, in different divisions, different single sign-on tools. It needs to take all of that into account when it's packaging and patching across the entire landscape of the organization. And that's what it's doing. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's why we call it AI. I think everybody's got a different definition of AI. Ours is really hinged not around machine learning, but around natural language processing and the inference of what you're reading in the natural language process.
I think too, so you can keep me honest on this one, Josh. One of the challenges in Windows patching in particular is you get a lot of the KB updates, and then you get the more kind of bundled packages that will happen on a regular basis. And if you're just doing pure vulnerability management, that's always been a challenge with teams, because they'll see like a number of higher critical vulnerabilities that can be patched by a single package that it then would include about 5 or 6 different KBs. But the tool itself will just tell you, well, you didn't apply this KB, so you still have the vulnerability, but it's not true. And I think that from the conversations we've had about the way that the AI is working within Aiden's platform, it accounts for that. So really what we're mostly concerned about is making sure we have the right package deployed, and then the vulnerabilities you kind of get for free because the AI behind it has already done that heavy lifting for you.
Any other questions for Dave or about Aiden? Yes?
For David, can you talk us through some of the other tools that you were considering and some of your requirements and how, what was your thought process?
The question is, can you talk through some of the other tools that they were considering, and what was his process for vetting and the differentiation and figuring out what you want to do?
So we didn't actually consider other tools. We had a number of tools already deployed. Many of them were looking at just the state of the network, the system, whatever. We had network scanning tools. We had some asset management capabilities. We also had traditional vulnerability management scanning, all of which needed some way to kind of coordinate, consolidate from the state of risk. And what I had done in previous organizations is we kind of built something ourselves. Like we had our own custom asset management database. We built all this DevOps around it, and it was expensive. You get to a good point because you control the experience, but then you control the experience. So then it's going to be very people bound, and when you have attrition, it gets really disruptive. So when we were going through the process, when I joined Invitae, and Josh said that they had this technology, I was like, I think I would rather try to see if I can get something off the shelf, work with them on where our custom needs are. They were fantastic. And now I don't have to go build the team and create out the whole DevOps model. I might do that later anyway, but it just gets easier because now they've done most of the heavy lifting. I can just add on the custom integrations at this point, which is a win-win overall.
So there's another question in the back.
How long does it take for it to learn the AI? Things that are specific to your environment. This is a good time to apply this back. And then more importantly, does it want us to know that, like this patch, that's going to cost something else to break for you to identify that it has broken some communication.
So the question is, how long does it take Aiden to kind of learn the right things to do in the customer's environment and be able to apply patches in a sequence where it won't break something else? If I can restate that, yes. I think it's a bit of a multi-part question for me in that, remember I mentioned before, Aiden's not machine learning, so it's not the kind of learning you're thinking where it's studying the environment for some long period of time or a regression test and having those may be things in our product roadmap years ahead, but right now there is an Aiden Labs engineering team. They are engaged with every customer and they are learning the customer's requirements, and there is some building or onboarding in the beginning. It's usually pretty fast. I think in the case of Invitae, it was about a month. Depends on the size of the environment, the requirements, but I was a customer before I became the CEO, and in my organization it was about 3.5 weeks, so that holds pretty true. The initial setup can be done in about 45 minutes to an hour, but then of course certain customizations have to be added to the package library. Aiden's policy files have to be built. We can start with templates, but they do have to be built. And so there is a consultative piece of that to get it up and running. But then it just incrementally keeps getting smarter and smarter from there as we add to it. I don't know if that answers your question 100%. And Dave, if your experience was the same.
Yeah, I think that, getting it operational was actually fairly quick. The ongoing sort of maintenance and tweaking of the environment, I think, is something that everyone's going to have no matter what. In our case, we typically would allow the patching to happen automatically in a more controlled environment so that we could do some regression testing and look at just whether things could break. We took those key learnings. We worked directly with Josh and his team to make sure that we could tweak our configuration files so that it was accommodating that. But I think that's also where Josh is saying that there's going to be some additional learnings from this at scale with other customers to try to figure out. There seems to be dependencies on this type of an update to this type of a software, which is what I think that they'll be building over time. But right now, I think it's more, every environment is very specific, and you have to be sensitive to that, and kind of doing it in an offline way before you do it, fully deployed is probably the best approach, at least in the short term.
And Aiden is getting smarter and smarter, as you just mentioned, over time. We're doing some of that already, in that you'll have a lesson learned from like maybe how a liquid handling robot at a genetics testing company needs to be updated in certain sequence, and you wouldn't think that would apply to a digital signage system or maybe an automotive human-machine interface. But the coding is so similar that it does. And as I mentioned, in the back end, it's a DevOps approach. So every single package that's generated in the Aiden Labs library is generated by code, customer-specific code and common code, and then it's merged together in the back end and put into each customer's virtual repository. And so what effectively is happening over time is it's like we're crowdsourcing from very smart people at all of our customers these incredible challenges, and then getting better and better at solving them. And so the speed with which, and I mentioned speed and visibility, right? The speed with which we're able to solve new challenges is getting faster and faster. We see onboarding downtimes going down and down every month. And we also are seeing the ability to quickly adapt to even a new use case, right? A new use case will come in. We just had a cyber forensics team that has a laboratory. They go out, and in this particular use case, they run investigations. They will bring in a whole team of people, run a huge investigation. And then when they're done with the investigation, they want to wipe and rebuild all the endpoints back to a desired state configuration or a guaranteed state. And they want to reset the lab, so to speak. And that process takes them a few weeks with about a dozen people. And they have HP supercomputers involved. It's not just laptops and other things they use to go out in the field and perform the forensic investigation. And we've just done a big pilot with them, and already we can reset the whole lab in a matter of hours. What was taking them weeks, and over a dozen engineers involved to do it. The question is, are there other policies and procedures that have been modified as a result of this innovation in your organization, Dave?
Yes, and the answer is definitely, right? It uncovered, I think, some operational opportunities that we had, let's just say. Right? Especially, what Josh highlighted was very specific for us as well. If we had to go and rebuild a machine, right? You're talking about something that had to exist in a certain state because it's under regulatory scope. It has to have certain packages applied, and it has to be in a certain order. Otherwise, you run the risk of not being able to, function properly. If you do that for multiple different systems in the environment that have each different layers of regulatory need, it starts to become very complex quickly. So that high-touch event then becomes really problematic when you have to have 4 or 5 different people addressing 4 or 5 different machines, all with a long laundry list of things that have to be done. So yes, we're talking SBOMs, things, your bill of materials for everything that constitutes the secure state had to be updated, had to be reviewed, had to be audited. So there was lots of opportunities, even from the policy standpoint, to say, nope, we need to do this and we need to be rigorous about it. And here's the implementation that actually allows us to do it quickly and securely and at scale.
Any other questions real quick? Or we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to ask you a couple of questions that I think a lot of people in this audience in particular probably would be interested in, but hopefully I'm right, which is, number one, I think people would love to hear, Dave, you've been a CTO, you've been a CISO now, you've had both titles at different times,
Yes.
And you've been at some major organizations, and you've brought revolutionary change a number of times. My question would be, how did you get to that? Right? How did you get there? What was that journey like? And if people in the audience are thinking like, I want to get there, what do people need to do to get there?
So my background is not technical by nature, I suppose. I got my degree in English Lit, so I focus more on the communications aspect of my college career. But that being said, I built my first computer when I was 13 or 14. So I've always been involved in tech, but I felt it was really important to have the communication background and be able to tell a story, right? When you think about the CISO role or the executive role in general, most of what we do is aligning messages to audiences. So if you're talking to boards, you have a certain level of vocabulary, let's say, that you're using. If you're talking to more technical people, you change the tone and the cadence of how you speak, right? And that skill, I think, is very important, especially nowadays with the proliferation of social media and the internet, and how we've kind of distilled down our messaging to 160 characters, very small sound bites. You lose a lot of the nuance and the context of what makes it important to get the gist of what the problem is. So my advice to anyone who's kind of looking to do this journey is, be really on top of understanding who you're communicating with. Also be very good at understanding what your problem statement is and being able to frame it in terms that your audience can understand. That's more than half of the challenge. Then the other part is just making sure you surround yourself with really good people, right? If you have teams that aren't really aligned with you, that's going to be a problem, right? So clearly networking is a big one for me, and it's been very helpful, especially as I've moved from different industry segments and talking with a lot of people at conferences here. You get a lot of insights by seeing how everyone is experiencing the same thing through a different lens, and then collectively you can start to really come up with creative ideas about how to solve these really big problems, but in ways that make it so you don't have to shoulder the entire burden yourself. So overall, I'd say a lot of grit, be humble, but also be hungry. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the kind of the ideal candidate, smart, humble, hungry. If you hit all three, keep that person, right? But I think it's just, we're in a very challenging time. We're coming out of the pandemic and everyone has been remote and disconnected, and now we're finally getting reconnected. And I think we have a unique opportunity right now to kind of revisit and rethink how we want to approach, big world work problems.
So I think that's fantastic advice, Dave, and it's great. And I think a lot of people can benefit from that in their careers. I always like to ask people this question, so I hope you don't mind. What was the biggest piece of advice you were ever given along that journey? How did it inform what you did? How did it change what you did? What was the reality after you heard it? What was the singular, in your mind, I know it's hard, but what was the best piece of advice you were ever given?
I'd say the best advice I could give anyone is don't be afraid to admit you made a mistake, right? And certainly don't try to cover it up, right? Because that's just going to lead to downstream pain, for yourself and others. But, and then that's probably where I think, being humble comes in, because arrogance can be a real killer, right? If you let it take control of you. But That's probably the best one. The one piece of advice I would say to anyone, if you're going to be a CISO, learn how to navigate stupidity, because there's a lot of it out there. And our ability to be successful is to try to get people to point the gun away from their face when they want to pull the trigger.
Yeah, so someone recently was saying to me, you can scale stupidity if you want to.
That's right.
And then you can scale costs.
Stupidity scales with the cloud, so keep that in mind.
Well, this was really fantastic. Thank you so much for not
Thanks
only
for having me.
working with Aiden, we really do appreciate it. You've been a illuminating use case for what we're doing, but for sharing your time so generously and coming today. And for those that don't know Dave Fluent from California, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone here. And thank you, everyone out there. Thank you so much for being part of it.